what was motivating, what was happening this day? Was there some type of trigger that, as you pointed out before, he's 63 years old. This is not his first day doing this job. Why that day? So is there something mentally or psychologically that he can get addressed or get treatment for that eliminates this or minimizes the risk of this happening again?
A man walked into a doctor's office expecting medical care. He was a patient. The person sitting across from him was a physician, a man whose job was supposed to be protecting his health and making him feel safe. But according to prosecutors, something happened during that appointment that would eventually turn an ordinary medical visit into a criminal investigation. The patient was reportedly developmentally disabled, and the doctor at the center of the investigation was Dr. Michael Rousseau, a prominent urologist in Claremont County, Ohio. Investigators would eventually accuse Rousseau of sexually abusing the patient during the medical appointment. But the allegations didn't stop there. According to court documents, Rousseau allegedly acknowledged engaging in inappropriate sexual contact during the investigation. And investigators also alleged that he told the patient to keep what happened a secret. Now Rousseau is facing serious felony charges, including rape, sexual battery, and gross sexual imposition. But how did investigators discover what allegedly happened? What exactly does the indictment accuse the doctor of doing? What did Rousseau allegedly tell investigators? And perhaps most importantly, what happened after a patient allegedly walked out of that office carrying a secret that authorities say should never have been placed on him in the first place? This is the story of Dr. Michael Rousseau. And at this point, it is important to make one thing clear. Rousseau has been indicted, meaning prosecutors have formally accused him of crimes. But an indictment is not a conviction. The allegations still have to be proven in court, and Rousseau is entitled to the presumption of innocence unless and until he is found guilty. With that in mind, let's go back to the beginning. Dr. Michael Rousseau was a practicing urologist in Claremont County, Ohio. Urology is a medical specialty dealing with the urinary system and, among other things, the male reproductive system. For patients, visiting a urologist can involve examinations and procedures that require a high level of trust. A patient may have to discuss deeply personal medical issues. They may have to undergo physical examinations. And because of the nature of the specialty, there are situations where a physician has access to parts of a patient's body that would normally be considered extremely private. That is why the doctor-patient relationship carries such a significant level of responsibility. The patient is supposed to be able to trust that the doctor is acting professionally. The doctor is supposed to maintain boundaries, and the examination room is supposed to be a place where the patient can feel safe. But according to the criminal allegations against Rousseau, that professional boundary was crossed. The alleged victim in this case was a male patient who was reportedly developmentally disabled. That detail became particularly important as investigators examined what allegedly happened, because this wasn't an encounter between two strangers. According to the allegations, the accused was the man's physician, and the alleged contact occurred in the context of a medical appointment. That distinction is at the heart of this case. At some point, the patient went to a medical office for an appointment with Dr. Rousseau. On the surface, there was nothing unusual about a patient visiting a doctor. People walk into medical offices every day. They wait in the lobby. They are called into an examination room. A doctor asks questions. A physical examination may take place. And eventually, the patient leaves. But prosecutors say something very different happened during this particular appointment. According to the allegations, Rousseau engaged in inappropriate sexual contact with the patient. The precise details of the alleged contact are contained in the criminal case and charging documents, and those details need to be understood in the context of the specific charges filed against Rousseau. Those charges include rape, sexual battery, and gross sexual imposition. Each of those offenses has its own legal requirements under Ohio law, but taken together, the charges show just how seriously prosecutors are treating the allegations. The central accusation is that sexual conduct or contact occurred in a setting where the accused was acting as the patient's doctor. And that is what makes the alleged encounter so disturbing. The patient was not allegedly meeting Rousseau socially. He was not allegedly in a private relationship with him. He was there as a patient seeking medical care. Another important part of this case is the alleged victim's developmental disability. According to the information available in the case, the patient was developmentally disabled. That doesn't automatically answer every legal question surrounding the case. A developmental disability does not by itself mean that someone cannot communicate, understand events, or make decisions. Those questions depend on the specific facts and circumstances. But prosecutors and investigators clearly considered the patient's vulnerability important enough for it to become part of the case. And it raises an important question. What happens when the person who is supposed to provide professional care is accused of taking advantage of the trust and vulnerability that comes with that relationship? A doctor's office can be an intimidating environment for anyone. There are medical terms that patients may not understand. There are procedures that require physical contact. And patients often assume that what a doctor is doing is medically necessary because they have placed their trust in that professional. For someone with a developmental disability, navigating such an environment could potentially be even more difficult. That is one reason the investigation into this case became so serious. At some point, authorities became aware of the allegations. The exact circumstances surrounding how the report was first made are an important part of the investigative record, but the investigation eventually focused on Rousseau and his alleged conduct toward the patient. Investigators began examining what had happened during the medical appointment, and as they looked deeper into the case, they reportedly obtained information about Rousseau's own account of the encounter. This would become one of the most important parts of the investigation, because according to court documents, Rousseau allegedly admitted to inappropriate sexual contact. That allegation is significant. But there is an important distinction between saying that a defendant admitted to a crime and saying that a defendant acknowledged conduct that investigators considered inappropriate. Those are not necessarily the same thing. Exactly what Rousseau allegedly said, what investigators asked him, and how his statements were interpreted are questions that matter greatly in a criminal case.
What was motivating what was happening this day? Was there some type of trigger that, as you pointed out before, he's 63 years old. This is not his first day doing this job.
Investigators reportedly questioned Rousseau as part of their investigation. During that process, according to the court documents described in the case, Rousseau acknowledged inappropriate sexual contact with the patient. For investigators, that could have been a major development. But an admission doesn't automatically end a criminal investigation. Authorities still have to determine exactly what happened. They have to establish when and where it happened. They have to determine whether the conduct meets the legal definitions of the charges. And they have to gather evidence that can withstand scrutiny in court. That means investigators would need to look beyond a single statement. They would need to examine the patient's account. They would need to consider the circumstances surrounding the appointment. They would need to determine whether there were witnesses. They would need to examine records and other available evidence. And they would need to establish whether the alleged conduct was criminal under Ohio law. As the investigation developed, another allegation reportedly became important. The allegation that Rousseau told the patient to keep the encounter secret. According to investigators, Rousseau allegedly instructed the patient not to tell anyone about what had happened. If proven, that would be an especially important part of the prosecution's story. Think about the situation from the perspective of an alleged victim. A patient is inside a doctor's office. The person involved is a medical professional. Then, according to the allegations, the patient is allegedly told to keep what happened private. That creates an additional layer to the case. Why would someone allegedly tell a patient to remain silent? What exactly was said? Was anyone else present? Did the patient tell someone anyway? And how long did it take before authorities became aware of the allegation? Those questions are critical, and they could help explain how the investigation eventually reached the point where criminal charges were filed. But again, the secrecy allegation remains an allegation unless and until it is established through admissible evidence or a court finding. Once authorities began investigating, the case became more than a dispute about what may or may not have happened inside an examination room. Investigators had to reconstruct an event that allegedly occurred during a medical appointment. That meant determining the circumstances surrounding the appointment and identifying evidence that could either support or contradict the allegations. Medical records could potentially establish why the patient was there. Appointment records could establish when the visit occurred. Investigators could examine communications and statements from people connected to the case, and perhaps most importantly, they could compare the accounts given by the patient and Rousseau. In criminal investigations, investigators don't simply have to ask, what does one person say happened? They have to ask, what evidence supports that account? What evidence contradicts it? Are there independent witnesses? Are there records that establish the timeline? Did the suspect make statements that can be verified? And, does the evidence satisfy the elements of the crimes being alleged? Those questions eventually led prosecutors to the charging stage. Rousseau was eventually indicted on multiple felony charges. Among those charges are rape, sexual battery, and gross sexual imposition. These are serious criminal allegations, but to understand the case, it is important to understand that prosecutors don't simply file charges because an accusation exists. They must allege conduct that they believe satisfies the elements of specific criminal offenses. The indictment therefore becomes one of the most important documents in the case. It tells the defendant what crimes prosecutors are accusing him of committing. It also provides the foundation for the legal battle that follows, and in Rousseau's case, the charges all relate to the alleged sexual conduct involving the patient. There is another reason this case has attracted attention. It isn't simply about an alleged sexual assault. It involves the alleged misuse of a professional relationship. Doctors are given enormous access to their patients. Patients tell doctors things they may not tell anyone else. They allow doctors to examine them, they trust them with their bodies, and they trust them with extremely private information. That trust is especially important in specialties where physical examinations can involve intimate areas of the body. The boundary between appropriate medical contact and inappropriate contact must therefore remain extremely clear. According to prosecutors, Rousseau crossed that boundary. The defense, however, will have the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of what occurred. That is an essential part of the justice system. At the time of the indictment, Rousseau remained legally presumed innocent. His defense team has the right to challenge the allegations. That can include challenging the credibility of witnesses, questioning how investigators obtained evidence, disputing the interpretation of Rousseau's statements, and arguing that the prosecution cannot prove one or more elements of the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. This is important because a criminal case is not decided simply because an indictment has been issued. The prosecution carries the burden of proving its case, and the defense does not have to prove that Rousseau is innocent. Instead, prosecutors must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction is extremely important when discussing a case like this publicly. As the case moves through the legal system, there are several questions that remain especially important. What exactly happened during the appointment? What did the patient tell investigators? When did the patient report the alleged conduct? Who was the first person to hear the allegation? What did Rousseau say when investigators questioned him? What exactly does the alleged admission contain? Was the alleged admission recorded? Were there witnesses? Are there medical records that establish the circumstances of the appointment? Were there communications between Rousseau and the patient? And what evidence does the prosecution have to support each individual criminal charge? These questions could become central to the eventual trial. Behind all of the legal terminology is a person. The alleged victim is not simply a name in a court document. He is a patient who, according to prosecutors, entered a medical office expecting treatment. If the allegations are ultimately proven, the consequences could extend far beyond the moment of the alleged encounter. An experience like this could affect someone's trust in doctors. It could affect their willingness to seek medical care, and it could affect the way they view institutions that are supposed to protect them. At the same time, the accused also has constitutional rights. Rousseau has the right to defend himself. He has the right to challenge the evidence. And he has the right to a fair trial. A responsible true crime documentary has to hold both realities at the same time. We can discuss the seriousness of the allegations without declaring someone guilty before a court has reached that conclusion. An investigation can remain hidden from the public for months, but an indictment changes the situation. Once felony charges are formally filed, the allegations enter the criminal court system. The defendant must respond to the charges, the prosecution must prepare its evidence, the defense begins building its case. And the court must determine how the case will proceed. At this stage, every piece of evidence can become important. Statements made during the investigation can be challenged, witnesses can be questioned, evidence can be examined, and attorneys can file motions regarding what should or should not be allowed at trial. That means an indictment is not the end of the story. In many ways, it is the beginning of the most important part. The eventual outcome of this case depends on what happens in court. There are several possible paths. Rousseau could reach a plea agreement with prosecutors, the charges could potentially change. A judge could rule on important pretrial motions, the case could proceed to trial. A jury could find him guilty or not guilty. Or the prosecution could face difficulties proving its case. Until that process is complete, it is not responsible to claim that Rousseau committed the crime simply because he has been indicted. The allegations remain allegations, and that distinction matters. There are many criminal cases involving allegations of sexual assault. But this case stands out because of the setting. A medical office is supposed to be a place of care. A doctor is supposed to be someone a patient can trust. And when the alleged victim is a vulnerable patient, the circumstances become even more serious. The case also contains another element that makes it especially disturbing. the allegation that the patient was told to keep the encounter secret. Then there is the reported statement attributed to Rousseau during the investigation. According to court documents, investigators said he admitted to inappropriate sexual contact. Those elements together are likely to become central to the prosecution's case. But whether they ultimately prove the criminal charges is something that must be decided through the legal process. Cases like this raise a broader question about trust. When a patient walks into an examination room, they often don't know exactly what every procedure involves. They rely on the doctor's explanation. They trust the doctor's professional judgment. They expect every physical contact to have a legitimate medical purpose. That is why professional boundaries are so important. When those boundaries are allegedly crossed, the damage can extend beyond one individual. It can affect the public's confidence in doctors and medical institutions generally. And when the alleged victim is someone who may already face difficulties communicating or navigating complicated situations, the importance of listening carefully to allegations and investigating them properly becomes even greater. So, what exactly does the prosecution have? Based on the information currently available to us, the case includes several significant allegations. First, prosecutors have accused Rousseau of sexual misconduct involving a patient. Second, the alleged victim was reportedly developmentally disabled. Third, the alleged conduct occurred during a medical office appointment. Fourth, Rousseau reportedly made statements during the investigation that authorities interpreted as an admission of inappropriate sexual contact. And fifth, investigators allegedly say Rousseau instructed the patient to keep the encounter secret. Those are serious allegations. But the strength of a criminal case isn't determined by how disturbing the allegations sound. It is determined by evidence. The prosecution must connect the evidence to the specific legal elements of each charge, and the defense will have the opportunity to challenge that evidence. As this case moves forward, several developments could be particularly important. First, any release of additional court documents. Those documents could provide more information about exactly what prosecutors allege happened. Second, statements from Rousseau's defense attorneys. His lawyers may provide a substantially different version of events. Third, any rulings on pretrial motions. Those rulings could determine what evidence a jury is allowed to hear. Fourth, testimony from the alleged victim and other witnesses, if the case reaches trial. And fifth, the final outcome. Only after the criminal proceedings are completed will we know how a judge or jury ultimately evaluates the evidence. The story of Dr. Michael Rousseau is still, at its core, a story about an allegation of trust being violated. According to prosecutors, a developmentally disabled patient entered a medical appointment expecting professional treatment. Instead, Rousseau is accused of engaging in inappropriate sexual contact with him. Investigators later looked into the allegation. According to court documents, Rousseau reportedly acknowledged inappropriate sexual contact during the investigation. Authorities also alleged that he instructed the patient to keep the encounter secret. Those allegations eventually resulted in felony charges, including rape, sexual battery, and gross sexual imposition. But there is an important line we cannot cross. At this stage, an indictment is not a conviction. Rousseau is presumed innocent unless and until prosecutors prove the charges in court or he enters a guilty plea. The evidence will have to be examined. Witnesses will have to be heard. The defense will have the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's case. And ultimately, the court system will determine what happens next. For the alleged victim, however, the story is about more than a criminal case. It is about what happens when someone places their trust in a professional who is supposed to protect them. A doctor's office should be a place where people receive care without fear. Patients should be able to trust that the boundaries of the doctor-patient relationship will be respected. And when allegations arise that those boundaries were violated, the investigation and the legal process become critical. For now, the case against Michael Rousseau remains unresolved. The charges are serious. The allegations are disturbing. But the final judgment belongs to the court. And until that judgment is made, the facts, the evidence, and the competing accounts all need to be examined carefully. What do you think about this case? Do you think the evidence described so far raises serious questions about what happened inside that medical office? Or do you believe we should wait until all of the evidence is presented in court before reaching any conclusions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this documentary informative, make sure to like the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. And if you know someone who would be interested in this case, thank you for watching.